Alessandro's infectious laughter echoed through the small Naples apartment as he attempted to twirl spaghetti on his fork, creating a magnificent mess that would have horrified his nonna but delighted any 7-year-old boy. This was the child who would soon find himself in Pope Leo XIV's arms, experiencing a miracle that would change everything. But tonight, he was simply the brightest star in his parents' universe, illuminating their modest dinner table with pure joy. "Papa, look, I made a spaghetti mountain." Alessandro giggled, holding up his fork triumphantly as strands of pasta dangled precariously, threatening to tumble back onto his plate. His dark eyes sparkled with mischief, the same eyes that had charmed every teacher, neighbor, and stranger who crossed his path. Maria watched her son with that mixture of exasperation and adoration that only mothers possess, while Giuseppe pretended to be shocked by the culinary catastrophe unfolding before them. "Mamma mia, Alessandro, you're poor. Nonna would faint if she saw you eating like a little savage," Maria teased, reaching over to wipe a streak of marinara sauce from his cheek. But her smile betrayed her true feelings. There was nowhere else she'd rather be than right here, watching her son's animated storytelling about his day at school, his hands gesturing wildly as he recounted every detail of his football match. During recess, the Rossi family had always been close, their small apartment filled with warmth that had nothing to do with the ancient radiator that barely worked. Giuseppe worked double shifts at the port to make ends meet, but he never missed these evening meals, these precious moments when Alessandro would chatter endlessly about his dreams of becoming a footballer, like his hero at Napoli, or his latest adventure with his best friend Marco. And then, "Papa, I scored the winning goal, and Marco said I was like magic." Alessandro bounced in his chair, his fork still loaded with the precariously balanced spaghetti mountain. Giuseppe's chest swelled with pride as he watched his son's animated face, those expressive hands that seemed to dance with every word. This was their world, simple, loving, complete. The three of them gathered around their small wooden table, sharing not just food, but dreams, laughter, and an unshakable bond that had carried them through Giuseppe's long work hours and Maria's sleepless nights when Alessandro was a colicky baby. But in an instant, everything changed. Alessandro's laughter stopped mid-sentence, his fork clattering to the table as his small body suddenly went rigid. His eyes, just moments before bright with joy, rolled back, and he began to convulse violently. "Alessandro!" Maria screamed. The fluorescent lights of Naples Children's Hospital cast harsh shadows across Maria's tear-streaked face as she paced the emergency room corridor, her husband's steady hand on her shoulder, the only thing keeping her from completely falling apart. Through the small window of the trauma room, she could see her son's motionless form, surrounded by a team of medical professionals whose urgent movements spoke louder than any words they could have offered. His heart rate spiked to 180, then dropped to 45 within seconds, Dr. Benedetti murmured to his colleague, his eyes never leaving the monitors that beeped and hummed around Alessandro's small frame. "I've never seen anything like it in a child. This age." Giuseppe pressed his face against the cool glass, watching as another nurse adjusted the IV line in his son's thin arm. Just 2 hours ago, Alessandro had been laughing at their dinner table, his whole face lit up with joy as he told them about his day. Now he lay unconscious, his olive skin pale and waxy under the hospital lights, looking impossibly fragile against the stark white sheets. "What happened to him?" Maria whispered for the 100th time, her voice hoarse from crying. "He was fine. He was perfect. He was just eating dinner and laughing, and then—" Her voice broke as she remembered the way Alessandro's eyes had rolled back, the terrible sound he'd made as his small body seized. The ambulance ride had been a blur of sirens and flashing lights, paramedics working over Alessandro's unconscious form, while Maria gripped Giuseppe's hand so tightly she was sure she'd broken something. The paramedic had used words like cardiac event and possible arrhythmia, medical terms that felt foreign and terrifying coming from his mouth. Dr. Benedetti emerged from the trauma room, his scrubs rumpled and his expression carefully neutral, in the way that doctors learn to mask their concern. "We've stabilized him for now," he said, but Maria caught the hesitation in his voice. "His heart rhythm has returned to normal, but we're still not sure what caused the episode." "But he's going to be okay?" Giuseppe asked, his arm tightening around his wife's shoulders. The doctor's pause lasted only a fraction of a second, but it felt like an eternity. "We're running more tests. His EKG shows some irregularities that we need to understand better. We'll need to keep him here for observation." As they wheeled Alessandro to the pediatric ward, Maria walked alongside the gurney, her hand resting gently on his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall that had become precious beyond measure. She didn't know that this was only the beginning. 3 weeks blurred into an endless cycle of hope and heartbreak, the sterile walls of room 314 becoming more familiar to Maria and Giuseppe than their own home. They had memorized every crack in the ceiling tiles, every sound the machines made when Alessandro's condition shifted, every expression that crossed the doctors' faces when they delivered news that grew progressively more concerning. "The beta blockers aren't working," Dr. Benedetti explained during their morning consultation, his voice gentler than usual as he reviewed Alessandro's latest test results. "His episodes are becoming more frequent, and each one seems to weaken his heart further." Maria barely looked up from her position beside Alessandro's bed, where she had maintained an almost constant vigil. Her son's face had grown thinner over the weeks, his once bright eyes now opening only sporadically, usually unfocused and confused. The boy who had danced around their dinner table seemed like a distant memory, replaced by this fragile child, whose chest rose and fell with increasing difficulty. "There has to be something else," Giuseppe said, his voice carrying the strain of sleepless nights spent in uncomfortable hospital chairs. "Another treatment, another specialist. We can't just watch him." He couldn't finish the sentence. The nights were the hardest. When the hospital grew quiet and the hallway lights dimmed, Maria would whisper prayers into the darkness, her rosary beads worn smooth from constant handling. She prayed the same words her mother had taught her, the same prayers she had said when Alessandro was learning to walk, when he started school, during all the normal moments of motherhood that now seemed impossibly precious. "Ave Maria, piena di grazia," she would murmur, watching the monitors that had become her obsession. Alessandro's heart rate would spike without warning, setting off alarms that brought nurses rushing in with worried expressions and hushed conversations. During the 4th week, a new doctor joined their team, a cardiologist from Rome whose reputation preceded him. Dr. Carletti spent hours reviewing Alessandro's case, ordering additional tests, consulting with colleagues across Italy. For 3 days, Maria allowed herself to hope again, watching the door for his return with answers. When he finally came, his expression told the story before his words did. "I'm sorry," Dr. Carletti said quietly, settling into the chair across from them. "We've exhausted our conventional options. Alessandro's heart is failing, and we don't understand why. The episodes are becoming more severe, and his body isn't responding to any of our treatments." The silence that followed was broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor, each sound a reminder that time was running out. The conference room, on the 6th floor, felt like a courtroom, where Alessandro's fate would be decided by a panel of distinguished strangers in white coats. Dr. Marchetti, the chief of pediatric cardiology from Rome's premier children's hospital, studied the thick folder of test results, while 3 other specialists huddled around a computer screen displaying Alessandro's latest echocardiogram. The left ventricular ejection fraction has decreased to 30%, Dr. Marchetti announced to his colleagues, his tone as clinical as if he were discussing the weather. Combined with the persistent arrhythmias and the episodes of ventricular tachycardia, we're looking at a rapidly deteriorating cardiomyopathy of unknown etiology. Maria gripped Giuseppe's hand as the medical terminology washed over them like a foreign language designed to exclude them from their own son's diagnosis. She wanted to scream at these learned men who spoke in acronyms and percentages about the child who used to sing silly songs while brushing his teeth. "In simple terms, please," Giuseppe said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "What does this mean for Alessandro?" Dr. Marchetti looked up from his papers, his expression softening slightly as he remembered the human element of the case before him. "Your son's heart muscle is weakening at an alarming rate. The irregular rhythms are becoming more frequent and more dangerous. We've tried every medication in our arsenal: ACE inhibitors, beta blockers, diuretics, antiarrhythmic drugs, but his condition continues to deteriorate." "But there has to be something," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. "A surgery, a transplant, something." The specialists exchanged glances, and Dr. Marchetti cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Rossi, Alessandro's condition is unique. We've consulted with cardiac centers in Milan, Munich, even Johns Hopkins in America. No one has seen this particular presentation in a child his age. His heart appears structurally normal on imaging, yet it's failing catastrophically." Dr. Santini, a younger specialist who had flown in from Florence, leaned forward. "We've ruled out genetic causes, viral infections, metabolic disorders, autoimmune conditions. Every test comes back normal, yet the heart continues to fail. It's as if something is attacking the cardiac tissue at a cellular level that we simply cannot identify." The words hung in the air like a death sentence wrapped in medical precision. Maria felt the room spinning as the reality settled over her. The best minds in Italy were admitting defeat. They had no answers, no treatments, no hope to offer. "How long?" Giuseppe asked, the question that had been haunting them for weeks finally spoken aloud. Dr. Marchetti's pause said everything before his words confirmed their worst fears. Dr. Marchetti closed the folder gently, the soft sound echoing, like a gavel in the small consultation room where Maria and Giuseppe sat holding each other's hands so tightly their knuckles had turned white. The afternoon sun streamed through the blinds, casting patterns across the desk that separated them from the words they knew were coming but couldn't bear to hear. "I wish I had better news," Dr. Marchetti began, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years spent delivering impossible diagnoses to parents who still believed in miracles. "Alessandro's heart is failing rapidly. The latest tests show his cardiac output has dropped below 20% of normal function." Maria's breath caught in her throat, a small sound that seemed to fracture the silence. She had prepared herself for bad news, had steeled herself through weeks of declined hope, but nothing could have prepared her for the gentleness in the doctor's eyes as he continued. "We've done everything medically possible. The medications are no longer effective, and his body is too weak for any surgical intervention. His kidneys are beginning to show signs of failure as well, which means his heart can no longer pump blood efficiently through his system." Giuseppe's voice came out as barely a whisper. "How long does he have?" Dr. Marchetti leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together on the desk. In all his years of practice, this moment never became easier, watching parents' worlds collapse. As he spoke, words that would reshape their entire existence. "Based on his current rate of decline, we're looking at hours, not days. His heart could stop at any moment." The room seemed to tilt around Maria as the reality crashed over her like a wave. Hours, not weeks to hope for a miracle treatment, not days to say proper goodbyes, but hours. She thought of Alessandro's laugh echoing through their small apartment. Just weeks ago, the way he would bounce on his toes when he was excited. The dreams he shared about playing football professionally someday. Can we take him home?" she asked, through tears that had started falling without her permission. "I'm afraid moving him now would be too dangerous," Dr. Marchetti said softly. "His condition is too unstable, but we can make sure he's comfortable, and you can spend every moment with him. The nurses will give you complete privacy." Giuseppe stood abruptly, turning toward the window as if he could somehow escape the reality being presented to them. His shoulders shook as 7 years of memories. First steps, bedtime stories, scraped knees kissed better, all condensed into these final precious hours. "We should be with him," Maria said, rising on unsteady legs. Dr. Marchetti nodded. "And there's something else you should know." The hospital room had grown quiet as evening shadows lengthened across the floor, the only sounds the soft whisper of Alessandro's labored breathing and the increasingly irregular beep of the heart monitor that had become the soundtrack to their nightmare. Maria sat beside her son's bed, her hand resting gently on his chest, feeling each precious rise and fall, while Giuseppe stood at the window, his silent tears reflecting the dim light from the hallway. Alessandro's eyes fluttered open occasionally, unfocused and glassy, but Maria treasured each moment of connection. His lips moved sometimes, as if he were trying to speak, but no words came. Only the faint sound of air struggling through his weakened lungs. The boy who had once filled their home with endless chatter now communicated only through the gentle pressure of his tiny fingers against her palm. Father Romano, the hospital chaplain, had arrived an hour earlier at Maria's request. He was a gentleman with kind eyes who had sat vigil with countless families during their darkest hours, and he understood the sacred weight of these final moments. He stood quietly in the corner, his presence offering comfort without intrusion, his rosary, beads moving silently through his weathered fingers. "Mio piccolo bambino," Maria whispered, stroking Alessandro's dark hair that had grown damp with fever. "Remember when you were 4 and you told me you wanted to touch the stars? You said if you jumped high enough from your bed, you could reach them." Her voice broke as she continued. Maybe soon you'll get to touch all the stars you want." The heart monitor's rhythm had become erratic, each beep seeming to take longer than the last. Dr. Benedetti had warned them that this was how it would happen, gradually. Then suddenly, as Alessandro's tired heart finally surrendered to the mysterious illness that had stolen their bright, laughing boy. Giuseppe turned from the window and approached the bed, his hand joining Maria's on their son's chest. "We love you, Alessandro," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We love you so much." Father Romano stepped forward quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, as he began the final prayers. "Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him." The ancient words filled the space between heartbeats, wrapping around the family like a gentle embrace. Maria felt Alessandro's breathing becoming shallower, his small chest struggling with each breath. The monitor's beeping grew slower, more spaced apart, and she knew they were approaching the end. Then, unexpectedly, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, purposeful steps that seemed to carry an unusual sense of urgency and hope. The usually bustling corridors of Naples Children's Hospital had taken on an unusual energy, with nurses whispering excitedly at their stations and security guards positioned at strategic points throughout the pediatric ward. Dr. Benedetti hurried past room 314, his face flushed with an expression that Maria had never seen before. Not the careful neutrality of delivering medical updates, but something that looked almost like wonder. "What's happening out there?" Giuseppe asked Father Romano, who had stepped closer to the door as the commotion in the hallway grew more pronounced. Through the small window, they could see hospital staff gathering, their voices carrying a reverent excitement that seemed completely at odds with the somber atmosphere that had settled over their world. Sister Catherine, the head nurse who had become almost family over the past weeks, appeared in the doorway with tears streaming down her face. Her hands trembled as she smoothed her uniform, and her voice shook when she spoke. "There's someone here," she said, her words barely audible. "Someone very special who has asked to meet Alessandro." Maria looked up from her son's bedside, confusion clouding her grief-stricken features. "I don't understand. Who would want to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Who would want to meet a dying child they'd never heard of? The footsteps in the corridor grew closer, accompanied by hushed conversations and what sounded like prayers being whispered in multiple languages. Hospital Administrator Dr. Toretti appeared behind Sister Catherine, his usually composed demeanor replaced by something approaching awe. "Mrs. Rossi, Mr. Rossi," he said, his voice carefully controlled despite the obvious emotion behind it. "We've had an unexpected visitor arrive at the hospital. He was visiting the oncology ward when he heard about Alessandro's situation." Dr. Toretti paused, as if struggling to believe his own words. "He specifically requested to meet your son." "Father." Romano's eyes widened as understanding dawned across his weathered features. His rosary beads slipped from his fingers, clattering softly to the floor as he crossed himself. "Madonna mia," he whispered, his voice filled with recognition and disbelief. Through the window, Maria could see a small procession approaching, men in dark suits flanking a figure in white whose presence seemed to transform the very atmosphere of the hospital corridor. Nurses and doctors lined the hallway, many with their heads bowed, others openly weeping as they witnessed something none of them had ever expected to see within these walls. The footsteps stopped just outside their door, and Maria felt her heart skip a beat as she realized who had come to see her dying son. When Pope Leo XIV stepped into room 314, the very air seemed to change, as if the presence of something sacred had transformed the sterile hospital space into a place of profound reverence. His white cassock moved gently as he walked, and his kind eyes immediately found Alessandro's small form on the bed, taking in the monitors, the tubes, the fragile boy who lay so still beneath the covers. Maria and Giuseppe stood frozen, unable to comprehend that the Holy Father himself had come to their son's bedside. They had seen him countless times on television, had followed his papacy with the devotion of faithful Catholics, but nothing could have prepared them for the gentle humanity that radiated from his presence in person. "Please don't get up," Pope Leo XIV said softly as Maria started to rise, his voice carrying the warmth and authority that had comforted millions around the world. "I am here for Alessandro." He approached the bed slowly, his movements deliberate and reverent, as if he understood the sacred nature of this moment between life and eternity. Alessandro's eyes fluttered open at the sound of the unfamiliar voice, and though his vision was clouded by fever and medication, something in his young spirit seemed to recognize the significance of who stood beside him. His lips parted slightly, and he managed the faintest whisper, "Are you an angel?" Pope Leo XIV's face broke into the gentlest of smiles as he reached for a chair, pulling it close to Alessandro's bedside. "No, my child, I am just a man who serves God, like your parents, like the doctors and nurses who have been caring for you." He settled beside the bed, his weathered hands folding in his lap. "But I have heard about a very brave little boy named Alessandro, and I wanted to meet him." The heart monitor continued its irregular rhythm, but something in the room had shifted. The oppressive weight of despair that had settled over the family seemed to lift slightly, replaced by something that felt almost like hope. Not the hope for medical miracles, but the deeper hope that comes from faith. "Your mama and papa tell me you love football," the Pope continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps when you feel better you can teach me some of your moves. I was never very good at sports when I was your age." Alessandro's eyes brightened for the first time in days, and Maria felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her son respond to the Pope's gentle presence. This was the most alert Alessandro had been in weeks. Pope Leo XIV slowly reached forward, his hands hovering just above Alessandro's small chest. "May I pray with you, little one?" Alessandro nodded weakly, his small hand reaching out toward Pope Leo XIV with the instinctive trust that only children possess. The Pope gently took the boy's tiny fingers in his own weathered hands. And in that moment, the bustling world outside the hospital room seemed to fade away completely, leaving only the sacred space between a dying child and the shepherd of the universal church. "Dear God," Pope Leo XIV began, his voice soft but clear, "we place this precious child into your loving hands." As he spoke, Alessandro's breathing seemed to steady slightly, his eyes fixed on the Pope's face with an intensity that surprised everyone in the room. Alessandro has brought so much joy to his family, so much light to this world. If it is your will to call him home, grant him peace. If it is your will to heal him, let your love flow through these hands. The heart monitor continued its erratic pattern, but something profound was happening. Alessandro, who had barely spoken in days, whispered, "I'm not scared anymore." His voice was clearer than it had been in weeks, and Maria gasped softly at the change in her son's demeanor. Pope Leo XIV leaned closer, his forehead almost touching Alessandro's. "You are so brave, little one, braver than any football player I've ever seen." He paused, then made a decision that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "May I hold you?" Without waiting for an answer, the Pope gently slipped his arms beneath Alessandro's frail form, lifting him carefully from the bed and cradling him against his chest. The boy's head rested against the papal cassock, and his thin arms wrapped around the Pope's neck with a strength that seemed impossible given his condition. In that embrace, time appeared to stop. The mechanical sounds of the hospital faded into silence, and even the irregular beeping of the monitors seemed to pause. Alessandro's shallow, labored breathing gradually became deeper and more peaceful against the Pope's shoulder. His small body, which had been fighting so hard for so long, finally seemed to surrender completely, not to death, but to something far greater. "I can feel God," Alessandro whispered into the Pope's ear, his voice filled with wonder. "He's here with us." Pope Leo XIV held the child closer, tears streaming silently down his face as he felt something extraordinary flowing between them. This was the moment he had prayed for throughout his papacy, to be an instrument of divine love when it was needed most. The monitor suddenly stopped its irregular beeping altogether, and everyone in the room held their breath, waiting. The silence stretched for what felt like eternity, broken only by Maria's sharp intake of breath as she stared at the flatlined monitor. But then, impossibly, a single beep echoed through the room, then another and another. The heart monitor, which had been showing the erratic, weakening rhythm of a failing heart, suddenly displayed something that made Dr. Benedetti, who had quietly entered during the prayer, freeze in the doorway. "That's not possible," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the screen that now showed a strong, steady heartbeat, not just stable, but normal. Completely normal. Pope Leo XIV continued to hold Alessandro, feeling the change before the machines could register. The boy's breathing had deepened against his chest, no longer the shallow, labored gasps that had marked his final decline, but the natural, peaceful rhythm of healthy sleep. Alessandro's skin, which had been pale and clammy with fever, was warming. In his arms, Sister Catherine rushed to the bedside, her experienced hands checking Alessandro's pulse while her eyes darted between the child and the monitors in disbelief. "His heart rate is 68 and steady," she announced, her voice trembling. "Blood pressure is normalizing. Temperature. She checked the thermometer twice, then a third time. Temperature is 98.6. Maria's legs gave way beneath her, and Giuseppe caught her as she collapsed into his arms, both of them staring at their son, who was now sitting up in the Pope's embrace, looking around the room with clear, bright eyes that held none of the confusion or pain that had clouded them for weeks. "Mama, Papa." Alessandro's voice was stronger than it had been since that terrible night at their dinner table. "Why is everyone crying? And why is the Pope here?" He looked up at Pope Leo XIV with curious innocence, as if he had simply awakened from a long nap to find himself in unusual company. Dr. Benedetti stumbled forward, his scientific mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. He had reviewed Alessandro's files moments before entering the room, had seen the test results that showed a heart functioning at less than 20% capacity, kidneys beginning to shut down, a body in complete systemic failure. "Run the tests again," he called to Sister Catherine, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Run everything. EKG, blood work, cardiac enzymes, everything." Father Romano had fallen to his knees beside the bed, his weathered hands clasped in prayer as tears of joy streamed down his face. In 40 years of ministry, he had prayed for countless miracles, but he had never witnessed one with such undeniable clarity. Alessandro looked around at all the amazed faces and smiled the same bright smile that had lit up their dinner table weeks ago. "Can I have some gelato now?" Over the next 4 hours, room 314 transformed from a place of death vigil into something resembling a medical conference room, as doctor after doctor filed in to witness what they could only describe as impossible. Alessandro sat cross-legged on his hospital bed, chattering animatedly with Pope Leo XIV about football, while medical professionals ran test after test, each result more bewildering than the last. "His cardiac function is completely normal, Doctor," Marchetti announced to the growing group of specialists, his voice filled with professional confusion. "Not improved. Normal. As if he never had heart failure at all." He held up the latest echocardiogram, pointing to images that showed a perfectly healthy 7-year-old heart. "The tissue damage we documented yesterday has simply disappeared." Alessandro, oblivious to the medical marvel he represented, was demonstrating his football skills by bouncing a small ball on his knee. A ball that Sister Catherine had found in the pediatric playroom after he'd asked if he could show the Pope his tricks. Each bounce was steady and controlled, performed by a child who, just hours earlier, hadn't had the strength to keep his eyes open. "The blood work is extraordinary," Dr. Benedetti said, reviewing the latest lab results. "Cardiac enzymes are normal, kidney function is normal, electrolytes are perfectly balanced. It's as if his body reset itself completely." Maria sat beside her son's bed, her hand resting on his arm, afraid that if she let go, this beautiful dream might evaporate. She watched Alessandro laugh as he told Pope Leo XIV about his best friend Marco and their adventures at school, his eyes bright and animated in a way that seemed miraculous after weeks of barely conscious whispers. "Mama, when can we go home?" Alessandro asked, finally noticing the tears of joy that hadn't stopped flowing down her face. "I want to see Marco and tell him about meeting the Pope, and I'm really hungry. Can we have spaghetti like we did before I got sick?" The casualness of his request, as if the past month had been nothing more than an unpleasant interruption to his normal 7-year-old life, left everyone in the room speechless. Giuseppe laughed through his tears, remembering that terrible night when Alessandro's laughter had turned to convulsions at their dinner table. Dr. Carletti, the renowned specialist from Rome, shook his head slowly. "In 30 years of cardiac medicine, I have never seen anything like this. Complete systemic organ failure reversed in a matter of hours. It defies every principle of medical science." Pope Leo XIV smiled as he watched the medical team struggle to explain the unexplainable. "Perhaps," he said gently, "some things are beyond the reach of medicine." The story was already beginning to spread beyond the hospital walls. Within 24 hours, the story of Alessandro's miraculous healing had traveled far beyond the walls of Naples Children's Hospital, spreading across Italy and then around the world with the speed that only true wonder can achieve. News crews gathered outside the hospital, their cameras capturing the testimonies of doctors who struggled to explain what they had witnessed with their own eyes. "I have documented everything," Dr. Benedetti told reporters, holding up thick medical files. "Complete heart failure to perfect cardiac function in a matter of hours. As a man of science, I cannot explain it. As a man of faith." He paused, emotion overtaking his professional composure. "I can only call it a miracle." The medical team that had treated Alessandro found themselves at the center of an international phenomenon. Dr. Marchetti received calls from Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and the Mayo Clinic, all requesting copies of the documentation. "The test results speak for themselves," he told his colleagues during a hastily arranged press conference. This child's heart was functioning at less than 20% capacity. His kidneys were shutting down. Every indicator pointed to imminent death. Now his cardiac function is superior to most healthy children his age. Sister Catherine, who had witnessed the transformation firsthand, found herself giving interviews to medical journals and faith-based publications alike. "I've been a nurse for 35 years, she said, her voice still filled with wonder days later. "I've seen people recover from serious illnesses, but this wasn't recovery. This was resurrection. Alessandro was dying in my arms one moment and completely healthy the next." Alessandro himself seemed remarkably unaffected by the global attention his story had generated. He sat in their small apartment, the same dinner table where his ordeal had begun, now covered with letters and gifts from strangers around the world who had heard about his healing. Children from schools across Italy had sent drawings, elderly grandmothers had mailed rosaries blessed by local priests, and families facing their own medical crises had written asking for prayers. "Look, Mama!" Alessandro exclaimed, holding up a hand-drawn picture from a little girl in Brazil. "She drew me playing football with angels." He was more interested in the new football his friend Marco had brought over than in the fact that his story was being discussed in hospitals, churches, and homes across 6 continents. His bedroom had become a shrine to childhood correspondence. Thousands of letters from children around the world, each one offering friendship and hope. "He just wants to be a normal 7-year-old boy," Maria told the gentle reporter who had been granted an interview in their home. "But what happened to him? It's changed our whole family. We know we witnessed something sacred, something that reminds us that even in our darkest moments, hope is never truly lost." She gestured to the stacks of mail that continued to arrive daily. "These letters aren't just about Alessandro's healing. They're about people rediscovering faith in their own lives." Giuseppe had returned to his job at the port, but his colleagues noticed a change in him, a peace that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep within. "Before this happened," he confided to his friend Antonio, "I thought faith was just something you did on Sundays. Now I know it's something that can literally save your life." His supervisor had offered him time off to deal with the media attention, but Giuseppe preferred the normalcy of his work, the familiar routine that grounded him after experiencing the impossible. Father Romano had become an unofficial spokesperson for the miracle, fielding calls from theologians and journalists alike. "What I witnessed in that hospital room transcended everything I thought I knew about prayer," he reflected during a television interview. "It wasn't just a healing. It was a demonstration of divine love made manifest in our physical world." The Vatican had issued a careful statement acknowledging Pope Leo XIII's visit to the hospital, while noting that any investigation into potential miraculous healing would require extensive documentation and time. Cardinal Turretti, speaking on behalf of the Church, emphasized the need for thorough investigation while acknowledging the profound impact the story had already had on believers worldwide. But for the millions of people who watched Alessandro kick his football in their small courtyard, laughing with the pure joy that had once filled their dinner conversations, no official pronouncement was necessary. Television crews from 5 continents had captured footage of him playing, and the image of his radiant smile had become a symbol of hope shared across social media platforms in dozens of languages. As the sun set over Naples, Alessandro ran into his parents' arms after a day of playing with his friends, his cheeks flushed with happiness and exertion. Maria held him close, remembering the weight of his lifeless body in her arms just days before, and whispered a prayer of gratitude that would never end. The world had witnessed something extraordinary, a reminder that miracles still happen to those who dare to believe. How could anyone who heard Alessandro's story, Ivo,